Hello, hello everyone. We're ready for our last session. And I'm sure it's been an exhilarating 2 days, and it's all to build up for this last moment. I'm sure we're at peak energy now. And that's what we would want, the full engagement of this group. My name is Hans-Peter Lankes. I'm the Managing Director at ODI. And the first thing I want to do is to thank Cabri, Dr. Kay Barn, and her team for the fantastic collaboration here. I also want to thank the National Treasury and the government of South Africa in general for being such wonderful hosts and participants at this event. So thank you to the National Treasury and to the government. Now, it's my job to try to land this plane. This is wording by Cajal, as you might imagine. And I couldn't be happier with than having this crew here. We will skillfully navigate and land this plane. We will crown this 2-day conference. We will provide a broad view on what's happening in the world and the G20 and how all those topics that we've been discussing are going to be channeled and resolved over the next year. We have with us the Honorable Minister of Finance for the Gambia, Minister Sidi Keita, who will be sharing his views on the role of the Finance Ministry in the digital transformation of government, the economy and society, and also on what kind of international cooperation and support he would value. We have Beatriz Vasconcelos on the left, and everybody's familiar with Beatriz, but let me repeat. Beatriz is a research fellow at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London, and she's currently researching the economics of DPI, part of which includes gathering the views of finance ministry officials around the world, including from many of you here today. So you have a very broad perspective from the bottom up here. We have Alison Gilwald. Do we have Alison Gilwald? Cajal. So Alison Gilwald is going to join us from Ethiopia. Unfortunately, she could not be here with us today. She's the direct... She's online. She can hear me. Okay, well, at least that. And she's the Executive Director of Research ICT Africa and a leading voice on digital equality, on data justice, and AI governance at both the national and international and the regional levels. And then, so we have actually, and this is something I wanted to add here, we're fortunate enough that both Beatrice and Alison also have deep insights into how Brazil has taken forward the DPI agenda during its G20 presidency after it was initiated under the Indian G20 presidency. And I wanted to read, a little bit out of turn, I'm sorry, but read a couple of sentences to you from the recommendations of the T20 just a few days ago in Rio de Janeiro. And if I understand correctly, those were closely discussed, coordinated with the G20 ministers, and it's very interesting and it could play a role in our discussion, so I'm just going to launch it there. So there, I think in total there are about 10 or so recommendations by the T20. 2 of them touch on our topics here today. Recommendation 6 is establish Data 20, D20. A multi-stakeholder platform to enhance cooperation on global data governance. Data 20 should serve as a hub for collaboration across the G20 and its existing formal engagement groups, promoting discussions and formulating policy proposals that leverage benefits, promote accountability, and reduce harms associated with the production and use of data, and there's explicit reference as it goes on to DPI and AI. Then recommendation 7 of the T20 is improve cooperation to enhance meaningful connectivity, inclusive DPI, and human-centered AI. The G20 should develop a common framework and leverage financial resources to promote the participatory governance and co-design of DPI and AI, fostering accountability and an inclusive, unbiased, self-determined approach to digital data development. So very interesting, touches on many of the things that we have been discussing here these 2 days. A call to the G20 and therefore to the South African G20 to take this on and make progress along these lines. We're going to come back to you, and this is why I also want to start with you, Khule, is it Khule? Khule Duma. Khule is a director in the private office of the President of South Africa, where he focuses on high-impact initiatives, including the digital transformation of the public sector. And Khule, I wanted to ask the first question to you. So the President of South Africa has mentioned DPI explicitly in his speech at the opening of the new parliament in July. How is the South African government thinking about DPI? How is it likely to feature in its G20 presidency? And perhaps you could also comment on the calls from the T20 that I just referred to.
No, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I think it sounds like there's been, a lot of positive discussions today. And I always start these conversations by kind of stating that, in the presidency, our role is a facilitation role in many instances. It is how do you, from the center of government, enable a number of ministries and actors within government to really focus on an objective, right? And so what that means is that you must be agile, and in some instances it means that you're not the expert in some of the things, but of course your job is to make sure that you bring in the appropriate expertise. Now, in terms of how we actually are tackling the DPI agenda, in the opening of Parliament addressed at the beginning of the 7th administration, you're correct, the President had indicated very clearly that DPI would be a lever of economic growth and inclusion. And I think that really speaks to effectively what we're trying to achieve. And this is why we've located the work on digital public infrastructure, or as colloquially we know it, digital transformation, within what we call Operation Vulindlela. Now, many of the colleagues will know what that is. Government, we like the term operation, not sure why, but I guess it shows the seriousness of what we're doing. But Vulindlela, which I think is more apt, is really about how do we open the way. Vulindlela is to open the way. The initial focus within the 6th administration of, as we call it, OV, was about making sure that you could reform those critical sectors, right? So some of the structural reforms around power, around water, transport, and so on. And one of the things that we've seen is about a 100-year reform agenda, the reform agenda that hasn't been, in some sense allowed to happen in 100 years taking place. So I think everyone will know that we had a power crisis here. And part of how we are dealing with that power crisis is about allowing independent generation to come in and private sector generation. In the second phase, it's about getting some of those aspects right, but we've introduced this focus on digital public infrastructure. Now, it's not the first time that the South African government has undertaken this piece of work. We've tried many times, and in fact, our colleagues here who've been with us on this journey will know that we are a country of plans and a country of policies, and on that sense, we are covered, well covered, to be quite honest. But really, it's about how do you get that nimble, fast approach, iterative approach of Operation Vulindlela, working with the right people in government to really focus here, right? And so we're in the process of putting together very quickly, very short, a roadmap, which really sets, these are what are going to be the what we could call the use cases. And we're still in the process of putting it together, but we know what is leading the charge. The first one, of course, is on the social grant system that covers, I believe it's more than 18 million people in this country, and a lot of people are quite dependent on it. And the issue, of course, with the social grants from a digital public infrastructure perspective is the fact that the first mile and the last mile are not digitized, right? So people must still go to offices that are in the middle of city centers. They must get on 2 or 3 taxis, you know, and we live in a country where people use 40% of their incomes just to get into kind of the economic nodes. So how do you digitize that, right? And how do you make sure that the people that are there are the right people in the first instance? Because during COVID-19, while there was a lot of success in terms of reaching people who needed means, like other countries, like the US, like even the most developed countries, we found that there were duplications in the system, there was fraud in the system. So how do you make sure that people, in fact, are the right beneficiaries? So really that's the first use case that we're working on. The second one, of course, is making sure that you can offer a host of services. You know, the important thing, of course, that what makes a digital public infrastructure is the fact that you've got a common stack of infrastructure that can be used across government, right? So interoperability and some of those aspects, data integration and those aspects. But we've got a number of things that we want to start with. And the digital ID conversation is massive because already the work is quite advanced, especially as it relates to the work that the Department of Home Affairs is doing. It builds momentum into the system that people can actually see that things are starting to work. And then, of course, similar to Brazil, you'd really want to look at something like a gov.br, but of course, within our context. We live in, I think, you know, e-gov really is a fragmented approach, right? It wastes resources, lots of money is spent having these very expensive contracts. And so the question is that, you know, government doesn't look at, people don't look at government as one singular, as multiple agencies. They look at government as one government. And so the user experience has to reflect that, right? And so these are the places where we think we could intervene. Of course, when we engage with the various departments, the question is, I have a problem, so how can you resolve the problem, right? And while we look forward to that, I mean, certainly Brazil is a leader, India is a leader, Rwanda even offering thousands of services through Irembo, we're saying, how do we start with like 4, 5, 6 services? We do those well. We actually shock people for once that we can do these things well. And then once we do that, and the back side of the system is actually working, then you can scale to 100 services. So that's really our approach. And ultimately, it's always about how do the poorest South Africans benefit? How do we make sure that people aren't relying on their grants just to get services? And how do we save people time and money? And we think in that sense it can be transformative. Now, as it relates to the G20, I mean, we're quite lucky because, as you've indicated, you've had both India and Brazil lead the charge. And in fact, the Indians and the Brazilians have been extremely helpful. We've gone to Brazil about 2 months ago. We're planning to go to India and constantly engaging with the ecosystem in India, not just the government, about how we actually tackle this. Of course, the context is not the same, but one of the things that we do appreciate is how do you scale things in an environment that doesn't have a lot of resourcing? And also, quite frankly, how do you do it in what sometimes is a complex political and governmental environment, right? And so you can learn from those particular colleagues as well. So I agree with what has been said by the colleagues in the T20, right? That group should be established because it is quite critical, just given the gap between what developed countries are able to spend on their DPI equivalents or their digitization equivalents and what developing countries are able to do. And so the ability to share that information, to share the skills, and in many instances to share the technology, I think is quite critical. And if this enables that, then I think quite happy. As you know, I think our G20 really focuses on sustainable development, solidarity, and equality, right? And those are really the 3 pillars which lead our work. And so for us, while we're still setting out what the G20 program is going to look like, for us it's quite critical that in our journey, which we really want to get accelerated next year, we're able to show some real examples of what it means to use DPI in a way that brings people that have been excluded for decades and decades into the formal economy. And of course, that is about digitizing the finance instruments as well, digital financial inclusion. But that is also about, as I've mentioned, making sure that services can come to where people are. And one of the things we're quite excited about, of course, is really understanding the nature of the, I don't know what you call it, the digital competency within our country, right? One of the greatest things I think about the African continent, and I think people have heard about it today, is the fact that, for whatever reason, we've kind of leapfrog, right? So no kind of landline in people's homes, but you've got cell phones, and you've got M-Pesa, and you've got all of these really great inventions that have come from the African continent as well. And my suspicion, even though we're working with some people that are going to let us know what the landscape is that we do actually have a competence within the population when it comes to technology. And for us, it's about meeting people where they are. So I think this is really going to be an exciting aspect for us. Thank you.
That's fantastic, cool. I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet, because you mentioned Operation Vulindlela.
It's also a wedding a song.
It's a song.
It's a wedding song, yeah.
Okay. Now that is an operation between the Presidency and the Ministry of Finance, the National Treasury. Can you talk us a bit through the role of the National Treasury in this, and why the National Treasury?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, the reason for, I think, Operation Vulindlela inherently is, as we know, over the last decade or something, the growth in South Africa has really not been at the levels that we would want it, right? I mean, you're looking at between 1% and 2% over the last decade and so. And I think also what's quite clear is that there's been a number of impediments that have prevented that growth from happening, and we're dealing with it on a daily basis, right? Obviously, the issues around energy come to the fore. The issues around aging infrastructure as it relates to logistics, as it relates to water, as it relates even to the ease of doing business, for example, getting a water use license. So I think, there was, in fact, a growth paper that started in National Treasury in about 2020 that really identified the areas of intervention that would unlock about 3 to 3.5% of growth if we really got all of these interventions and these structural reforms right. So in fact, the impetus of Operation Vulindlela actually comes from the National Treasury. And I think it's kind of, it's self-evident National Treasury would actually care about something of that nature. Now, why it was then brought, I guess it was shared between National Treasury and the Presidency, was inherently you had a president, in President Cyril Ramaphosa, whose number one priority was economic growth and job creation, right? And especially coming out of the COVID-19 crisis and the impact that had really unleashed onto the country. So what you have is at least a structural reform agenda which has in many instances, the support and the political will from the level of the Presidency. And again, it's about facilitating. But a big driver of that work, the big part of the capacity of that work, of course, sits within National Treasury as well. So National Treasury is absolutely key, and I'd like to stress that in many instances, they are actually the ones who have come up with the idea.
Well, this will be music to the ears of our colleagues here in the room. And with that, thank you very much, Kule. With that, I'd like to turn to Alison Gildwald. We now have you in the room, Alison, just so you know. You're on our screen, very large, looming behind us here. Now, it's actually ironic almost that we're in South Africa and you're not. But we understand you're traveling quite a lot at the moment, including you were at the T20 handover in Brazil. And that's also something that I would like to ask you about. Specifically, can you tell us a bit about the topics that are emerging around the DPI agenda from Brazil's presidency of the G20, how they might be important for South Africa to pick up, in what way? And I would ask you, both in the interest of the G20, or in South Africa, but also in the interests of Africa as a continent. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you so much. Yes, I could even see on the screen that I was looming above you. So I was indeed at the T20 in Rio last week, where there was a communique released that we've been working on for quite a while, which is the implementation roadmaps for a number of those recommendations. And so what I'd indicated to Kafal that I'd speak about a little bit today was about the recommendation on the need for data governance for DPIs. And I think this has emerged from the work, including the work done around the D20, which we're hoping there'll be greater traction on. Because in fact, in a lot of the areas, across from AI, which is now going to be a task force for the South African presidency, G20 presidency, to DPIs, all of these, there's a lot of focus on the technology. And what is missing, and this came out of the G20 recommendations when the first DPI recommendations came out, they said, we've done all this thinking around the infrastructures, and now we need to hand over to Brazil to do the data governance framework. And the Brazil recommendation says that there's still work to be done here. We've been focusing on other things. And so that's really the handover to South Africa, is to develop that data governance framework. And so we looked at that. We've been working with the Digital Transformation Track and, of course, the Digital Economy Working Group from India. And no pressure on South Africa, but we've got to land it here before the G20 presidency, of course, goes to America after this. But I think there's been a lot of work done on the digital transformation agenda, and specifically on DPIs that have been taken forward. Obviously, in the Indian context, that looks very different from what it does in Brazil. And I think Brazil, the focus has been quite a lot on public sector and what it means for that. And in South Africa, as I said, what we've offer in this implementation roadmap is really looking at across the DPI infrastructures, the kind of governance you need, but also looking at very much from an African context. We work as Research ICT Africa, we work across the continent, and we assisted the African Union on preparing a very progressive data policy framework that's now being implemented in various parts of the country and of the continent. And it's obviously the tension is for domestication and harmonization of that, which would really support DPIs. So the work that we've been doing on DPIs has been very much in the context of broader work that we've been doing around digitization and state formation, revenue generation, social protection. This is work that came out of COVID, where working across Africa, but including in South Africa, the majority of people were unable to digitally substitute to manage risk, to mitigate risks associated, public risk, economic risks, public health risks, economic risks during COVID. And so really it was the most marginalized, the poorest that were at greater risk and fared more poorly out of that. And in the case of South Africa, although we've actually just finished big household surveys, nationally representative household surveys across the country, across the continent, and although South Africa has over 70% internet penetration, the actual intensity of use, this central wicked problem of the digital inequality paradox of the global digital compacts trying to address, us layering these layers of advancing technologies over each other without addressing these foundational inequalities, that really means that we're not all benefiting from these technologies. So in South Africa, for example, although we've got relatively high internet penetration rates, there, a range of factors, but mainly developmental challenges. So the biggest thing that drives internet take-up is education, and of course the corollary of income and employment. And South Africa's, once you look beyond access, if you actually look at use, South Africa's struggling for these. And this is, exacerbated several times more on the continent. So reference was made to, the progress made in Rwanda around e-government services, etc. But internet penetration rates there are, under the 20% critical mass that one needs to see, associations with economic growth and having lots of e-government services when nobody's online to use them is obviously not the intended purpose. So I think DPIs are going to have to look very different in the context of Africa and of South Africa, but in the context of Africa, and I think we are trying to bring an African lens to this. I think when we look at the different infrastructures, however, our digital infrastructure, our data infrastructure, our digital ID, our data platform, our data exchanges that we need on this, we've got enormous challenges around the governance of that. And we tend to look at them as very isolated. We look at sort of our broadband challenges and the governance issues around that. We look at our data infrastructure challenges around that, digital ID, and we don't actually look at the real cross-cut here is actually data and governing that data. But I think importantly, in terms of how DPIs have been framed from a governance point of view in the work that's done to date, is that there's the focus on creating this trusting or enabling environment has mainly been around security and data protection, privacy. And I think there's been a lot of work, including in the T20 and other briefs on data justice, et cetera, which look at the need to have a trusted environment that also has, is based on something more than that. So that has legitimacy, that there are human rights protections for people that extend from purely privacy and protection rights. And I think that's the real contribution of the kind of economic justice to this governance, that the governance frameworks to date have been very sort of compliant regulation, you either breach a privacy law or something like that, but they haven't really looked at the extent of economic regulation we need in order to redress not only those harms and safeguard people from those very uneven harms that we see at the moment, but also to create the economic opportunities that are so unevenly distributed currently. And so I think that raises, a lot of the issues, a lot of the papers that are looking at digital public infrastructures start off by looking at, I think, a lot of our multilateral organizations, they're looking at, digital public infrastructure readiness, digital readiness at the infrastructures, at the different infrastructures and where they are. And of course, those are, as I said, those are kind of very concerning. We don't have a big Aadhaar bio ID, platform to move off. We don't have a big financial inclusion platform to work off. So those are going to be challenges. I think, across the continent, everybody's speaking about, market failures. And of course, we have had regulatory reform failures, mainly because of not effective, very effective regulation. But the challenges here are that we are going to have to be looking at public-private partnerships for investment, creating those conducive environments for that, consumer welfare, much more favorable consumer welfare outcomes if these DPIs are going to perform those kind of digital public good roles and, and be for benefit of all. And so I think that's the real, one of the big challenges for us as we take this over and really provide an African lens to this, is to say, unless we actually look at those institutional challenges, unless we look at the lack of institutional endowments that we've got across the continent, if we don't look at sufficiently safe legal environments that's particularly safeguarding, if we don't look at the human capability to absorb this, the sort of human development challenges, we are going to again sit with a fabulous model, but that is not actually designed for our own political economies. And so we really have to do a lot more about the whole digital ecosystem, and in fact the whole the structural inequalities in the economy, etc. Because simply putting a high-level framework with infrastructures that may work for those who are connected and doing well, without looking at full data governance for this, but also of course broader digital development and in this context, in this day and age, digital development and economic development. And so perhaps just in an appeal as we go forward, because this agenda has just been set, is that I think in the broader focus of the G20 agenda, I think it's there in the Digital Economy Working Group, and I'm sure it will emerge. But I think compared to the centrality of digitization in the G20 agenda from India to Brazil, I would love to see the digital dimensions of this surface as it's handed over to South Africa, and the work of the T20 consolidated under South Africa's presidency.
Great, thank you so much, Alison. There was a whole lot there. Can I ask you in 2 sentences, what do you think would be a realistic ambition for the South African G20 in this respect?
Well, I suppose because that was the recommendation that was made to, that we built this implementation framework on, is that, and this is what, we also proposing through the Digital Economy Working Group, if that comes together as we hope, is that South Africa is going to provide this, now increasingly global governance framework that it's got to fit into, but provide the data governance framework and broader than data, digital governance framework that's, being called for since the DPIs were introduced in India, and have now taken on the recommendation in Brazil. And so I really think that could be an incredible contribution to whether DPIs are going to be a successful failure, particularly on the African continent.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alison. With that, I will turn to Beatriz Vasconcelos. First, a special thanks to you for running the workshop today on the role of the finance ministries and supporting DPI. I think that I was sitting in there at one of the tables. I think that participants really enjoyed that discussion. It goes to some very crucial questions that everybody has to ask themselves here. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you learned from today's session, but also more generally from the work that you've done canvassing all these finance ministries over time.
Now it works. Well, thank you for the question. I think I'm gonna mix a little bit with the learnings about the economics of DPI with a little bit of the G20 discussion, because I've been also following the Brazilian government for a while. As a disclaimer, I'm Brazilian. I think the good news is that I think there is a lot of good energy around the recognition that these transformations, especially the DPI one, can have a lot of economy-wide benefits. Therefore, Ministers of Finance should care. We did a little bit of a poll, and we saw that most people recognize the value. They think that the Minister of Finance should have a role. But we also learned that most of the ministries are not thinking about technology. So that's a little bit concerning. But maybe what I want to say is, and that's the thing that relates the 2 agendas, I still think that there's a little bit of conceptual confusion, and I think the conceptual thing, is what we are facing in the digital age, right? As governments, as organizations working on this space. Every day there's something new. There's AI, there's DPI, GovTech, there was digital transformation, eGov, like what are those things, like what's the difference? And I noticed that there was a little bit of confusion around that when we were discussing. And when we're talking about the benefits of digital, I think no one disagrees that there's a very clear value proposition. Everyone knows that digitizing is good, creates efficiencies, there are reasons to care. But I think the difference, what we're talking about here, and what was very interesting that India did, is that they didn't recreate, they didn't create anything like drastically new, but they did put the attention on the fact that some of those systems have become horizontal. And I think that's the thing that we need to remember. We are not just talking about digitization. The difference here, and the thing that is gonna bring really like economy-wide effects, is the fact that it's shared. And again, then the danger is, let's then not obsess too much about the India example, I think. It's very helpful. I think I was talking to the Brazilians and they said, you know what? We were doing a lot of those things. Like, we were doing digital services, we were doing the project of digital ID, we have change, we have the payments, we're just calling it DPI. So it was very helpful that India actually brought the attention that these systems are society-wide systems. But then what I fear with the G20 agenda is that and the fact that India and Brazil are taking a leadership role is that maybe these are going to become the models, and then some countries are going to try to adopt whatever they were doing without really thinking about like what are the capabilities that you have and how to move in that direction. So I'm a little bit concerned about this notion of copying, and I'm a little bit concerned about conflating digital with digitization with the horizontal DPI approach. So there are two things. And the issue of capacity, I remember I worked with Minister Stina Lawson in Togo, and it was a really remarkable time. Like, I really enjoyed working with her, and I was very confused because at some point I was working with Novici, which is the cash transfer program, and it was a very interesting program, but I joined her after it was after the rollout. And she asked me to just focus on helping they had some developers from Madagascar working with Togo, and she asked me to spend all of my time working with those developers on a dashboard for Novici. And I was very, very confused, and I said, okay, fine, I can do that, but I don't understand. Like, we already know the data, you don't need a dashboard, like, what are you gonna do with it? And she said, you know why I'm doing this? Because when the next crisis hit, I want these developers to know what like high quality standards mean for us. And that was a very big lesson for me. I was like, wow, she's really thinking about like building that muscle and that capacity for the next thing. So I say all of that because I think it's great to have those models as inspirations, and I think we should we should be really thinking about how to build those shared layers. But also, it's really important to know like where we are right now. And the other day, I think yesterday, we were having some conversations with the planning department, and they asked me, so what would you do if you were us? I said, you have to answer that question. I don't know what you're gonna do, but so yes, I'm just concerned that a lot of people are gonna have opinions about what the next is, and only you will be able to tell that. But it's important to think about like what's the next thing that you can do to build capacity towards the vision. And my other concern about the G20 is it is wonderful that there is a lot of positive global South energy and leadership. I think there are very few topics in which the world is looking at the global South, unfortunately, because I think there are amazing innovations happening, but it is one that we can take leadership, and we can proudly say that we're doing much better than a lot of countries that are much wealthier. At the same time, because there is a lot of energy around the G20, I'm afraid that there's so much excitement, so many organizations want to work with the topic, that I'm afraid for you that a lot of organizations are going to come to you and say, hey, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, I can help you. And this will happen with all the other countries. And so, again, it's wonderful to have the help, but then it's really good to have some clarity on what you want to do and what are the next steps so that you can leverage that help. What else? Yeah, I think there's that. Maybe just one point on the economics of DPI. And just to go back, because I forgot to say that. So I was saying that digitization, yes, it creates a lot of efficiencies. The shared approach, the point that we want to emphasize is the interoperability, the reusability. These are the technical aspects that are going to create the externalities, the spillovers, and the market shaping effects. By market shaping, I mean we can be in competition in our markets, we can be creating new industries, we can have like economy-wide effects. So again, just to wrap up on this concept that like really horizontal thinking, let's think about the questions of capacity, let's not let anyone tell us what we need to be doing, and be very like, aware of like what South Africa wants, what the other African countries want, and let's leverage the help and the positive energy, but knowing really like what you need to do to build that muscle. Because otherwise, the other thing that is happening is the political economy is really real, and it's very funny because we go all over the world and we are seeing, for example, Google, Amazon, and a lot of other players sitting in the DPI, organizing DPI conferences. And not saying that they don't have a role, I think they have a very important role, but you know, if we always ask the question of capacity and the answer is we don't have the capacity right now, let's outsource, we're never gonna build that capacity. So I just think, yeah, like clarity, like reflection, and being really careful about like each player and their intentions, I think is gonna be important for keeping this agenda going in a very constructive manner.
Thanks, Beatrice. Can I ask you one follow-up question? So you mentioned the question of capacity and the need to develop that. What about money? So what's your sense? Do finance ministers generally feel ready? Is there a good do we have estimates of what it will cost in each of these countries and where the funding would come from? Yeah. Is it domestic? Do they need international assistance? What do you see?
That's the question that is motivating the project, because a lot of countries are like, okay, how much it's going to cost? How much, like, what are the savings? Like, what's the return on investment? The return on investment is, well, first of all, very few countries have that answer. That was the hypothesis, but that's what we're learning, because even in, let's say, Estonia, everyone talks about Estonia, everyone talks about India, even they make back of the envelope calculations. So it's really hard to measure those numbers, because you're not just reducing duplication and having some local effects. Like these spillovers, these externalities are really hard to measure. So just to be clear, very few countries are doing this, but what we learned is you don't have to make the full calculation. Sometimes you just justify that this approach works for one specific ministry, one specific service. Then you can just complement the narrative by saying, by the way, if we do this in a way that can be scalable, we're going to have much wider effects. And usually it is the case that even doing this approach just for one specific ministry or one specific service already pays for the cost. There is a bit of a difference between like big countries and small countries, because the whole logic of infrastructure thinking also relies on reducing transaction costs and leveraging that. So, for example, for India, they're going to say that the digital ID costs $1 per person. I think that's going to be really hard to replicate in any other country, just because their marginal costs end up being lower. So I think for smaller countries, we have to think about other ways of maybe sharing the capacity with other countries, or potentially we have to make a stronger case for investment, because it's not straightforward.
Thank you, Beatrice. And with that, we will turn to Minister Keita. Thank you for your patience. This has given you, I hope, the opportunity to listen to all these views, and let me up front also say thank you, and how impressed we are with your commitment to this topic. The fact that you have been with us all here for 2 days is fantastic, and it shows how important this is. And it shows how seriously you take it, and therefore your voice will carry a lot of weight here. So I understand that digital transformation is a priority in the Gambia, and we've learned that the central bank aims to increase the use of digital payments through GamSwitch, that the government is hoping to roll out a new digital identity. Also understand that the government in the Gambia has made very effective use of open source software for administrative systems in the health and education sectors, and for civil registration. So there's a lot that's been going on. Now, based on that, 3 questions, and I'm going to put them to you up front, and then you can see how you want to respond to that. First is, what do you hope to achieve through digital transformation? How will you inspire this group here? With the Gambian example, but also with the Gambian goals here. Second is, what is the role of your ministry, the finance ministry, in supporting these digital transformation initiatives? And then third, what kind of support would you value from external partners and through international cooperation initiatives led by the G20 or the African Union? So how do you connect to this broader discussion that we have been so tapping on now? Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much. I begin by thanking the CABRI and the ODI for organizing such a very apt topic and conference which is focusing on digital transformation and DPI as far as public financial management is concerned in Africa. We thank also our host, the Minister of Finance of South Africa, for the hospitality accorded us since our arrival. I think the timing could not be apt more than it is now because, as we know, the public policy space should move from intuitive-based policy making to data-driven policy making. And that cannot come without a robust technology platform. What we do have before was that we have isolated systems in different ministries, and that has its own problem of silos, data not speaking to each other. And as such, what we need now going forward is to have this DPI approach where you have a commonality of data and interoperability of your systems. And as such, public policy will now be based on a common data platform which is robust and validated, as such can better manage and better help making public policy. It is within this context that the government of His Excellency the President has in 2022 created a whole Ministry of Digital Economy to ensure that the digital agenda of the economic development is at the forefront. And also to take this wholesale approach of looking at how the digital transformation of the economy can take place. Simply because it is no longer viable that we go at the space of our economic development using the historic norms. Rather, we should leapfrog and leverage on what best practice is available elsewhere. And DPI is one of those technologies available there so that we are able to expedite and fast-track our economic development. What are the benefits of these? And these form the digital strategy, the central bank intervention to ensure common payment platform through the GAMP switch, and the ministry coming with a digital strategy that will be implemented in the next few years. Because we realize that using the digital platform, it can generate many valid and fast approach to economic development. For example, in the Ministry of Finance, some of the key quick wins that we have realized was the introduction of a common integrated financial management system, IFMIS, which is able to expedite the production of the government national budget, quick finalization of the public financial accounts. And just as a history, we used to have a legacy system where it will take a couple of years after end of the year to prepare a public financial statement. And by the time it is ratified, it's like 4 or 5 years in waiting, which is basically not of much use. But now with the IFMIS system, the backlog has been literally eliminated, and we are almost on track to produce financial statement within a couple of months after the end of the year. The other benefit we accrue to the public financial management is, or of the arena of the system, is it ensures accountability. It ensures public sector value for money expenditure. Public resources, wherever they are deployed, can be traceable. We have rolled out a new procurement procedure whereby we are coming up with an e-procurement model. This will not only eliminate waste, but will also fast-track public service delivery to where it is most needed. We believe the gains in this space will far outweigh any investment cost in the platform. The other issue we have found is how quickly can government service reach to the beneficiaries? As you know, the role of government is effective service delivery. We believe the technology platform and the technology strategy that we have will enable us to reach where our impact or where our need as a government is most needed at the shortest possible time. Looking at the intervention in the social safety net, we're using the GAM switch, we're using the mobile money to roll out the intervention to the less privileged so that the people who are most needing of government services are able to get it. The third element we have seen as a payoff, which is quite substantial, is the domestic resource mobilization. We have digitalized our operations at the customs, and our revenue authority has gone digital to the point it is now web-enabled. This has made it so efficient that business community no longer needs to wait until the working hours of the customs authority to be able to conduct their business, but they can sit any part of the world 24 hours, 7 days a week, and complete their transaction. This has reduced the cost of doing business, and of course, because there is very limited human interface, the revenue mobilization has really increased. We're pleased that since the implementation of the new system, we have seen the domestic resource mobilization grown by leaps and bounds. We are on course this year to register for the first time the realization of more than $20 billion as domestically generated revenue. And this is where Africa needs to focus on. Because if you look at our development agenda, it is high time that we look inward for our national economic development. The donor fatigue, debt vulnerabilities that we are all going through means that the only solution is inward. And it's very simple. Even our donor partners, the debt to tax revenue to GDP in the OECD countries is about 35%. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's only hovering around 16%. That means that we should have these economies of scale to make our tax collection more efficient by not only overtaxing the few that we are taxing, by broadening the tax base and bringing more people into the digital network, into the tax net through digital platform. These are all opportunities that we have seen, and as such, we are going ahead. Currently, our own tax to the revenue is hovering around 12%, which means that we have opportunity to scale up our domestic resource mobilization that will generate the needed resources without overburdening the few that are under the tax net and provide the needed resources for economic development. We are also using digital platform to also ensure our service delivery is operated within a public accountability lens. Today, we publish the budget implementation on our website after the end of every quarter, and we also prepare citizen budget, engage the citizenry on how we are utilizing public resources. This, in a nutshell, are the payoffs that we've seen with the digital transformation that our country is undergoing. And we believe it cannot continue with the siloed technologies that we are operating. And the way forward is through the DPI. The second question you mentioned was about the role of the ministry. The ministry is a coordinating ministry, and we have the opportunity at the same time to be the planning ministry, that government strategy are developed within the ministry, and we have seen the DPI as the key enabler of service delivery, value for money, public expenditure. As such, we are at the forefront of developing the National Development Plan, and our recovery-focused National Development Plan is anchored on a digital transformation of the economy. So we are at the center stage of not only developing the roadmap to transform the economy through digital lens, but we are also working with the digital ministry for them to roll out their digital strategy, which they have introduced. And of course, as a finance ministry, we have the levers to pull to ensure that the sectors and the various arms of government comply. For example, we have seen enormous gains in public expenditure management when we roll out the IFMIS to the government, local government authorities. So now, the way forward, in order to increase the economies of scale, we are now coming with a pronouncement that will make all publicly funded institutions through the Exchequer to use the government public financial management system. so that there is more transparency, value for money, and fast and expeditious service delivery. These are the payoffs we have seen. But of course, like I have said at the beginning, this cannot be done through the existing digital structure we have. It can only happen through an integrated DPI approach where we all have access to the same common standards of data and the systems have interoperability amongst each other, and as such there is less data redundancy. So this is the way forward, and this is the thinking of the government. And we as a Ministry of Finance, we know that, and that's why our role in order to fast track this rollout is to ensure that we mobilize the needed resources. We are working with partners such as the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, to be able to support in the acquisition of some of these softwares, some of these technology platform, as well as to give us knowledge, lessons learned elsewhere. We go on study tours to see how other countries are doing it and ensure that the resources are available to roll out. One simple example which we are actually rolling out as we speak is the integrated human resources management system. Okay. Even as part of the project preparation, the first course of action is to do data cleansing. That data cleansing exercise has so far identified more than 3,000 ghost workers. Imagine the economic benefit of savings resulting from that. So these are why our role is, we know the value of integrated, of a DPI system in government. As such, we go all the way out to garner the necessary resources to make sure that government is able to roll them out across the entire economic system.
And just out of curiosity, do you, the Finance Ministry, pay for this? Is it your budget line, cross-government, or how does it work?
Well, of course, Finance Ministry is the ministry that prepares the national budget. So some of these strategic budgets are in a centralized vote, which we call central services, where we compile all the resources required for such projects. But of course, we don't prepare all the funding. We work with partners because these are very expensive systems that support, but also we do our own domestic contribution through government local funds in order to roll this out. So this is our journey in the digital transformation of the economy. And the early signs that we have seen is at the pace we are going, we believe the payoffs far exceed the cost. Thank you.
Mr. Minister, just sort of one other question to get us also going on the panel afterwards is with your experience, and especially your experience in the context of limited capabilities, what you have achieved so far, what is your advice to the South African G20? What should they push for? What should they push for Africa?
I think what our experience has been is no one can do it alone. Partnership, knowledge sharing, lessons learned, learning from each other, and sharing of experience and expertise is very central to this. Because not only do you need the fiscal resource in terms of money, but you also need this experience so as to avoid going through the trouble that others have gone through. So for example, before we roll out some of our systems, we have done study tours to other countries that have implemented such systems and learn from them. So I think the whole principle of economic development, no country is an island, and best practice should be shared. And the greatest data sharing and information and knowledge sharing is what I believe will lead to the quick wins in order to roll it out. Because if you want to do it all by yourself, there'll be resistance. And there's any resistance in the change process that DPI introduces. So you should see the other countries, how have they been able to identify these impediments or challenges, and what tools do they use so that you can dovetail it and put it in your local context as to how to roll it out. Because the last thing you want to do, you can have all the funds, you can have all the technology. If the human willingness is not there to address that resistance, you cannot do it. So I think it's no longer about just money. It's about being able to use the soft power, the soft skills, to be able to allay the fears and the resistance that is with any system implementation. Because it requires a whole sea change. I remember when we were launching the Ascuda wall for the GRA, I was warned that as a finance minister, this system will crash. And you shouldn't roll it out because nobody has ever done it. But we have done study tours, we've seen what other countries have done, and based on those lessons, we are able to implement it, and so far we've seen positive dividends. So my advice to South Africa in their G20 presidency is to ensure that they don't go it alone. If you go alone, you don't go far enough, but if you go together, you can go a longer distance. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Minister. So before we turn to the group, we're like a little bit later than we were, but I think we have a few minutes, right? I hope. I would just want to go to Kule. Your reaction to this? What do you take from this discussion?
No, I absolutely agree with the minister, and would like to really thank him for sharing, I think, that experience. I think the work that is happening in Gambia is I think really commendable, and so we've been going on a number of study tours already. So I think the next place we need to go is to see your beautiful country. But I absolutely agree that you don't walk it alone, and I'm almost trying to balance it with what Beatrice had said. The first one is about 2 months ago. I think, Richard, you were there. We found ourselves at the Global DPI Summit in Egypt. And I had arrived 1 or 2 days later. The team had been there a bit earlier. And when I found them, they looked like they had been whacked with something. and basically what they had been whacked in was a whole bunch of offers from anyone they talked to help us with our DPI journey. It really was overwhelming. I mean, after 2 or 3 days of it, we just wanted to hide in a corner. And everyone had an agenda on the G20. Everyone said, do this and do that and do, and we were quite grateful. But, we were also just trying to get our heads around, what is this? What is it going to look like? And so I think one of the lessons that's come out is that even though we need to use that international experience, we first need to understand what our local context is, what effectively is driving the work, and then we're able to go to the partners that have solved for it. And you'll find, of course, when you engage the partners, they raise 1 or 2 or 3 issues. But the other thing that I'd really like to touch on in partnership is that we're talking about international partnership, which is quite critical. There's probably another panel on sovereignty, right, and what that means within the kind of DPI agenda. But the thing that we're really gifted with in South Africa, and that I think we need to utilize from a capacity perspective, of course we must build capacity within government, and I think that is central to it, is the fact that we do have quite what I'd say, mature private sector, right? And in some sense, you also have an ecosystem which is globally competitive. I think about kind of the ecosystem that we have in places like Cape Town and so on, that we should really be leveraging, right? Because again, it would be, I think, quite ridiculous to think we can walk this journey, as the finance minister has indicated, alone, without really using the wealth of resources that exist in this country. We have one of the best banking industries in the world, and so from a payments perspective, we should really be able to leverage on that. The thing that, again, looking at the other parts of the world, is that yes, it's about delivering services. Yes, it's about bringing government closer to people. But the second aspect is also about how do you support an ecosystem, right? And one of the things that the Indians have done is that through their digital public infrastructure journey, they've been able to empower SMMEs to be part of this journey, right? And a lot of that has been done by what the minister said, making sure that the components are open source. That is things that we have to think about, right? Because I don't know about you, but I'm tired of these really smart young people getting on flights to Amsterdam to go support that economy. I'd rather have them here serving the people of South Africa.
Okay, well, I think that gets us off to a good start for the room. And so please lift your hand if you're in the room. You also, if you are online, you have the Q&A box, and we will be, somebody's going to tell me about your questions. So shall we shall we gather your interests? As I said, we're at peak energy now. This is the moment. Frederic, please.
Thank you so much for fascinating and very, very rich discussions. In the roundtable before this one, we were debating and someone mentioned the concept of a Pan-African DPI. How do you react to that, especially given the need for localization, local knowledge, local context? Is it something that could even be conceived, and how would you go about it? Or is it just one of those ideas that look good on paper, but don't touch it?
Does anyone want to add a question at this point, or we come back and I put the Pan-African question to you? Perhaps you start, Kule, and then we will ask the others.
You know, to be quite honest, it's a question that we're also trying to wrap our head around a little. So I won't speak with any kind of authority on it. But I mean, one of the things that has also been great, as I think the minister has indicated, Beatrice, in a Togo example, is that obviously there's a lot of areas in the continent where I think they're really centers of excellence in terms of this piece of work. So I don't think we're struggling with a capacity issue. Of course, things can always be better, you know, and I think anyone in any kind of government system will say that. But there's really a base in which we're building on. Now, the question is, you know, I don't know, has a kind of similar system been built anywhere else within the European Union, for example? Are there kind of horizontal systems throughout countries? That would have to be something that, you know, quite frankly, we would have to learn from. I do think that there are areas, though, however, where you could start to, you know, start to kind of play around with it, right? So, for example, if you look at the African Free Trade Agreement, I think that is really the basis. How you actually develop, I think, more trade within the regions, how you reform some of the customs regulations. I think there's a real opportunity there, right? It's a bit ridiculous that, for example, you know, you are constantly asked for documents in this continent on the site that you exit and the site that you enter. Why can you not actually share that information, because you're talking about the same person? So I think there are certain areas, right, that also then facilitate the policy objective of making sure that there can be more intercontinental trade. But as to, you know, if you're extended to other services, you probably would have to learn from the rest of the world.
Thank you, Kule. Alison, any views on sort of a regional arrangement?
Yes, I did want to come in. So, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, because I think it goes back to the original point we were making that's come out of the, you know, G20 during the Troika leadership, is that, you know, if we're just talking about connecting infrastructures or whatever it is, I mean, you know, technically that's possible. It's really about the governance and the harmonization you need. And in fact, many of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union is precisely facilitating this. So the African Union Data Policy Framework is a harmonization framework for the planned single digital economy of the digital transformation strategy that is, you know, built around supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area. So, you know, I think there are examples of interoperable infrastructures in Europe that are used across countries, and so I think that technically it's obviously possible. I think the real question is issues of harmonization, and I think the work that's been done around the necessary data interoperability and data flows, the objectives of the framework that are being implemented right now are around developing standards and categorization, so that we can get cross-border data flows that are adequately protected and reciprocal and those kinds of things. So I think it's actually about the very big challenge of getting the governance frameworks that we've got on our radar, that we've got on our big frameworks in place, and also coordinating them. So we've got now agreements with the digital trade protocol, digital trade protocols, conducted in secret. So we've only got the leaked copies of those. A very a transparent process that basically signs us up to exactly the same requirements as the WTO. That wouldn't allow us to leverage African data, which is largely flowing out the continent, for our use internally, for government planning, for researchers, for entrepreneurs to be building this, innovative digital economy that we want, data economy we want. But I think it's possible if we can get the governance and institutional frameworks right.
Thank you, Alison. Did you want to come in, Minister?
Yeah, I want to come in on that because I think that's a very noble objective, but we have to be practical. Before we go there to say we want a common African DPI, we have to get the basics right. And to get that, we all know it will take time. So as such, it's better we start small and build core competence, centers of excellence, but ensure that we have common standards. If you have common standards such as open data system, data interoperability, common data standards, then it will seamlessly fit through. But if we don't do it that way, we want to go for that big bang African DPI, it will never happen and it will just be a vision. I think it's high time in Africa we be more realistic in terms of our planning, start small, be nimble, and then progressively move forward. But in so doing, before you even go that, let's start with the basic. Look at trade. We do less trade among ourselves than with outside world. And the payoff of common trading system, like the African Continental Free Trade, the common payment system of Africa Exim Bank, these are very important building blocks that can come into the common DPI. I think for me, that's how I would see it. We should be more practical than leaving that out and say we are hitting for something, shooting for the stars, when we are able to do our basics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think that was very, very helpful. I have one hand here.
Yeah, thanks. That was really great because I'll come up to being the person who was talking about that, and I think next year is the start of the Africa Stack to 2063, not the year we build it all. So I think that's really important. I want everyone except Kule on the panel to answer this because we need to find out. If everyone on the panel could finish the sentence, the G20 next year would have been a success in terms of finance ministries and DPI if what happens? What do we announce at the end of the handover of the G20 that says we've really got something significant as South Africa?
Let's hold that thought. I think that's a good one also to end our talk with. But let me take two more, and then we distribute the questions. I have Kahal, and then I have a gentleman from Kenya. Kahal?
Thanks, and thanks to all the panelists. This has been fantastic. I was one of the people at the DPI summit annoying the rest of the team from South Africa. Come to my conference, come to my conference. One thing that struck me about the DPI summit is there wasn't that many people from the private sector there. Someone mentioned it today, private innovation on top of public rails. For this conference as well, it's an open secret we're having a conference. Anyone from the private sector who wanted to get in touch with us, we would have been glad to have them. Should we be worried that this is just a conversation that we might be having amongst ourselves? Where is the private sector innovation that's going to be built on top of these public rails?
Thank you, Kahal. Yes, please.
Yes, thanks to the panelists for the wonderful insights. Just a question again around how the governments are thinking about capacity for DPI in the continent. And I'm putting this question to both Hule and the Honorable Keita. Do you think the continent, particularly our higher education, is well prepared to drive this agenda going forward? What's your thinking about the investments that needs to go into our universities, our education system, starting right from the basic levels in order to build the next generation of Africans to drive this going forward. I ask this because you'll remember that the morning presentation was led by a professor from University College London. And a lot of the DPI discussions I've had here is my alma mater, Cambridge, all from outside there. And I really want to hear from Keita particularly, what's the thinking in the continent around really investing in our systems to drive these conversations forward? Thank you.
An excellent set of questions. Shall we just go sort of this way, Beatrice? Do you want to start? You pick the questions you want to answer.
Yes, there's no question directed to me, but I have opinions. So maybe on the question of the private sector, I don't know if, of course we're not going to do anything alone. Government cannot do and should not be doing anything alone. And I really liked what you're saying, Kule, about changing the perspective now for governments being a facilitator of an ecosystem. And I think that's why I disagree with the morning panel in which there is a question about what's the difference between platform and DPI. I think a lot of the thinking around platform is the idea of a closed ecosystem and maybe focus on services, and the idea of DPI is more as an ecosystem. So of course we do need the engagement with the private sector. At the same time, I think we need to differentiate like what kind of private sector and what kind of discussion we allow them to have a strong opinion on. That's my opinion, because I think the big tech, for example, they have very strong opinions on a lot of those things, and they do have a lot of capacity. And again, we will need them, especially like in the cloud. The cloud market is very concentrated. Some countries that are trying to build their own, but it's like hard. So of course we need to collaborate with them, but also be aware of the incentives. And for example, in Brazil with PIX, the government didn't start by saying we are going to build the payment system. They declared that it would be really nice that the private players would come up with an interoperable solution. And they waited, and nothing happened because it's not within their incentives. So I think we have to think, okay, we want to help the private sector. We need to be engaging with them. We are doing this for citizens, but also for economic development, to help foster like more industries. But ultimately, I think some government oversight and directionality will matter a lot. Then maybe just one point. I think we are talking a lot here about learning from others, especially like in the African continent. So yeah, like don't listen to Brazilians, don't listen to Europeans. Like let's think about, let's learn from each other. And maybe that's the Pan-African DPI could be more about like let's set these like learning function and be sharing with each other, like learning. But I'm also afraid that and the learning function is I think is one of the most essential ones. The digital world is moving so fast that these reflective capacity, the learning capacity is important. But I want to differentiate learning from outside versus learning by doing and learning like internally. And again, to my point in the first half, I think if we don't learn by doing, then government capacity is going to be zero within a few years.
I mean, I agree with Beatrice. I think where the private sector, we shouldn't have an expectation that the private sector is necessarily going to be involved in everything. I mean, having spent most of my career in the private sector, and then part of what we do in the presidency is to support we have a partnership between, big business and government, specifically on energy, logistics, and some interventions on crime and corruption. What you learn working with the private sector and having been in the private sector is that the private sector is really only going to show up in the way that in a way that you want, if it really is aligned with their interest. And that's not a negative thing, right? So for example, extremely involved in energy supporting us, extremely involved in logistics, because that supports the bottom line. And so I think when you know how to match that with the work that you're doing in government, I think then you have synergy. And I think that's where you have momentum. And so I think you've got to kind of look at it like that. Now, if it's a conversation about standards and policy, you know, only the big tech companies will really show up to that, and that's fine. So I think we need to be a bit more intentional about how we get them involved. I think, for example, on payments and revolutionizing that system, the banks are certainly interested in that, in how digital identity facilitates people onboarding onto the banks and getting accounts and so on. 100%, they're going to come to the party, and so getting them involved in the everyday work and building and so on is going to be quite critical. The second one, of course, is around the African view of our talent and how we develop that. I mean, I think the minister is probably best placed to answer that question. But my view, especially when it comes to this idea of an African X or an African thing, is that, again, you know, we're a very big continent with 1 billion people, with 50-something countries, with different national agendas, and there are commonalities, of course: development, creating jobs, growing our economies, moving away from resource extraction. All of those are quite critical. But I first think it's important, as the minister has indicated, to almost start with like a regional view of things, like what can we do from the region, and I think that's probably how we should approach education. For example, South Africa in the region is I would say probably the kind of hub of some of the best universities within the region, right? And I think we've benefited a lot from having some of the expertise from in the region kind of in our universities. You can see it in the professors, you can see it in the expertise that comes out. And so the question is, how do you leverage that, right? The problem, of course, as a lot of colleagues will know, is that they're very concentrated within 5 or 6 universities. And those are and I think they're world leading, they're really great. The question for us as government, which is similar to my answer around the ecosystem, is how do you involve the other, you know, what we called previously black universities, for example, in the actual building of the components, in the actual building of the DPI infrastructure. I was quite impressed when I went to the Tshwane University of Technology, which is a fantastic institution, but it's not going to be rated 1 or 2. And what young people are doing there, and they're crying for resources, they're crying to get actually involved. So I think really that's our role, and I think if we can kind of use that across and have a kind of regional approach to it, then I think it's fantastic. Once we've got it right between these kind of, how many countries do we have? Southern Africa, 6 or 7 countries, then maybe we'll come back and give you an answer about what we should be doing in other parts of the continent.
Thank you very much. I think on the issue of higher learning and its relevance in order for Africa to leverage into the DPI world is that we have to get the basics right. By that I mean is, of course, for DPI to roll out, there are certain prerequisites. You need to have good electricity, stable, accessible and affordable electricity, reliable internet. All of these are prerequisites for an effective DPI. We know Africa doesn't have that on the scale that it requires for an effective DPI. But that's no excuse that we shouldn't start. We should start small, scale up, and do more of the same. And learning by doing should be the way forward, because we will not be able to have all the prerequisites in place before we leapfrog. But rather, we can build on what we have. We all know the electricity access is not at the level that, and if you look at internet speed and accessibility, but that shouldn't stop us from actually taking on board. Because if you look at the impact of Africa's development agenda that has actually stolen it back, is the public policy decision-making process. Public policy is time that it is formulated using data. Because if you look at all the big companies in the world, they are technology companies, but underlying that is the power of their control over data. Google is what it is today, not because of its technology, but because of the data. Amazon is not Amazon because of its merchandise, but because of access to data. So it's high time, as such, that the public officials of African governments look at data critically as the new gold of economic development. And whatever it takes, we should start small. Even if we may not have all the prerequisites, we should start small and scale up. And with that, I'm sure we'll find a way out. Of course, the role of the private sector are looking for returns. And they would want predictability. For that to happen, the role of government should be to create an enabling environment, rule of law, transparent process, to ensure that they can actually bring their expertise to the table and they will not suffer inconsequential decision. Because if the enabling environment is right, that is the key mandate of government, to set the enabling environment right, to ensure that due process is followed, to get certain essential infrastructure in place. Like, for example, it will be very difficult and expensive for a private sector to run a internet landing cable. Those critical investments should be bankrolled by the public sector. And this is where the international financial institutions are helpful, because they know the investment required is large, and as such are supporting a number of African countries to do those heavy lifting financially. As such, but once those internet landing cables have landed, what is the rule of law? What is the process of distributing access? Do you have to snuffle development by making sure that there is no transparent process on who gets access to which fiber? Those are the little building blocks that we need to ensure that the private sector is informed and encouraged to come to the table. And with this, I think government should go back to its role, not to be in business. It is actually a common phenomenon that government is not supposed to be in business, but it is there to set the enabling environment. And that being the case, it should do the heavy lifting, key large infrastructure investments, but also more importantly, the due process and regulatory framework that enable the private sector to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We will have to come to a close, and Alison, I know that you haven't had a chance to respond to the questions, but can I ask you, therefore, to be the first in our final quick-fire round to fill in the blanks? That was a great question here. What does success look like, a year from now? Alison, do you want to start with that?
Thank you very much. I'm going to just finish off that sentence by saying that DPIs aren't inherently transformative. And so it's really this governance framework that we require in order to ensure that we get these, really kind of redress some of the very uneven distribution of the benefits that we currently see in the market reform outcomes that we've seen, across, or the failure of those successes. But I just did very, very quickly want to say that in the sort of, spirit of solidarity of the South African government's G20, and in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, that it's not about, actually whether we've got the infrastructures and they're connected everywhere. It's exactly about those enabling frameworks that we're talking about. And we're talking about a data economy. These are not scarce resources. This isn't gold or oil. This is a data economy that's a global economy, and it's concentrated outside the African continent, maybe in 2 countries around the world. The only way that we are going to be able to get compete in this data economy, get the economies of scale and scope that we need, is to do this across the continent. And of course, we work within the RICS. That's how the African Union's always worked. They've not always been as successful as we might like them to be, but of course, that's one way, because there's some greater commonalities and those kinds of things. But really, the vision of harmonization of these enabling frameworks that we're carrying out, that we're assisting the AU do in the Gambia for the data policy towards the end of the year, these are really important enabling frameworks exactly to manage better the private sector that we've not done very successfully, to protect ourselves, utilize, leverage big tech, who are right at the table every time some new issue opens up. And we've got strategies being rolled out all over the continent, different strategies, whoever's comes first, always got the biggest purse. So really developing these enabling frameworks, I think, will lend themselves not just to DPIs, it's not just to, AI strategies and various things like that. I think there really is a lot of potential within a Pan-African, institutional arrangements and harmonization.
Thank you, Alison. That was a sizable blank. Now, Beatrice, to you. What is your how do you fill in the blank here?
Okay, so 1 year from now, I think with India and Brazil, their biggest achievement, I think, especially with India, was to put DPI in the vocabulary of digital ministries and ICT ministries. 1 year from now, I would love to see DPI in the vocabulary of ministries of finance.
Very good. Kule, you're the one who will have to deliver. So what are you going to... He's not supposed to. No, but you may sort of indicate your hopes.
Okay. No, I was hoping I was out of this. We tried, Richard. Look. Mine is not complex. It's linked to the work that we're doing, which is not a kind of document, but rather a roadmap to quick and efficient scalability. How do you do it fast? How do you do it within the confines that you have, the skills, the resourcing, and how do you deliver impact that aligns with your national objectives? It's not as simple, but it's as simple as that.
Thank you, Kule. Mr. Minister, you have the final word, and this is a message to South Africa.
Thank you very much. I think the message to me is very clear. The business case is already there. We've seen the economies of scale that can come out of this adoption of DPI. As such, it's just because government is the lead agency for such type of, due to the linkage of regulation. But were this an open private sector, we would not be discussing this because the market participants would really have taken advantage over it. So it's high time when such obvious payoffs come, which are so glaringly clear before the public, particularly government, put aside all issues and look at the national well-being for the country through adoption of technologies such as the DPI. As we know, even from the policy formulation stage, the payoffs that we can make as government, individually and collectively as a continent, far exceeds the investment required in the DPI framework. As such, we should put aside all silo thinking and look at the bigger picture and adopt this as a way forward to enhance our economic development. This is only not just because of the payout it brings, because it also brings with it credibility. With the DPI framework, there is going to be more transparency, there's going to be more accountability of public activities and public policy. As such, I think that the ball is in South Africa's court to at least ensure that the ministries of finance are not just sympathetic to the idea, but are actually supporting it because of the economic gains that accrue to adoption of DPI. So to me, it's not just, we should not just talk, but we should walk the talk. And we should ensure that this communication is spearheaded because of the payoff that the entire continent will benefit from by its adoption. As challenging as the obstacle may be, but I think we should have quick starts, and we start small and scale up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. That was really fantastic. I think we have a very clear guidance here from the panel. From the G20, we need a framework. And from countries, each country here, with finance ministries showing great leadership, we need a pragmatic approach. Let's do it. It's clear that it is beneficial. We need to move forward. And with that, we are closing this panel, and we're going to give a very big hand to it. We all stay.
Audible? Good. May I please ask the management committee members to join us on stage as well? Management committee members, may I ask you please? Thank you very much, everyone. I think mine is to do some conclusions, which is always a very, very difficult position. You've all had lots of provoking thought and a very productive 2 days, I hope. And so to actually conclude for you on behalf of us seems to be a little bit presumptuous, but nonetheless, I'm going to try to make a few concluding comments, more specifically perhaps from this panel. I do encourage you though, as we always would, in terms of good peer learning, which means learning from each other and learning by doing, to make a mental note of that action and decision that you've made now and that you're going to take back with you into whatever your domain is, whether it's a country, we pray so, and also into your institutions if you are one of our donor partners, one of our development partners, and international think tanks, etc. So from today, I think there are lots of lessons as well. The really encouraging thing is there are no naysayers in the room. Everybody is in agreement that we do need to have digitization and we need to have a digital roadmap, and everyone is excited about what is upcoming in the G20. For ministries of finance, I think it is very clear there is certainly a role for ministries of finance. In a sense, we go back to basics. I think Honourable Minister had mentioned that. We do have our traditional role, which is providing challenge and oversight, that challenge function in a finance ministry, a coordinating ministry that needs to look at prioritization and the will of the people relative to the purse. So that function remains. We do have a bigger role, I think, in culture setting, to encourage agile processes, to reset some of the rigidities that are within our systems, for example, in procurement. However, governments are there to be the rule setters. So this is just about checking in, reflecting, and in an agile way, adapting the rules as we need to, and to make sure that we do get that matching set of synergies within government and also between government, citizens, the private sector, etc. So essentially ours as ministries of finance is to frame the conversation. We of course still want to talk about efficiency. We can't have finance ministries that are not focused on efficiency. However, efficiency is one of the elements. A finance ministry will still be looking at country mandates and country development objectives, will still be focused on efficiencies for the purpose of the betterment of the people in terms of addressing inequalities, poverty, and any burning issues that may present themselves in terms of crises. These will all be addressed by ministries of finance. I think it is very, very clear that doing nothing is also a decision. And I think it is perhaps something, digital is perhaps something that has crept up on some finance ministries. However, I think it is clear to everyone now that if you do nothing, in essence, that is a decision and it's not the best decision. So we really do look forward to what is going to happen in this space on the continent. I'm going to pause here and make no more conclusions and allow you to conclude the rest for yourselves. What I would really like to do is to ask the Honorable Ambassador of the Republic of Gambia to South Africa to please join me on stage. May I please ask Her Excellency Fatoumata Jompa Sise to please join me. And I also acknowledge the Deputy Ambassador, Buba Sane. Welcome to you as well. I would like to ask the Ambassador.
I was scared. I thought you wanted me to say something on financing.
You may say something on financing. It's the people's budget, after all. I have asked you to please grace us with your presence up here. I would like you to formally present an award to the Honourable Minister of Finance, whom we are very, very pleased also to have present. We also thank you very much for the commitment of the Republic of the Gambia and for the support that we've got to this conference. May I please ask the Minister to step forward? May I ask you formally, Madam Ambassador, to present this to the Minister. It is an award of championship. We have heard your commitment. We are very, very happy to be led on the continent by ministers such as yourself. And we ask you please to accept this award on behalf of CABRI and the CABRI member countries, and also on behalf of everybody present here. I'm sure on behalf of ODI Global and also our partners that have made this possible. Thank you very much. We are also proud of him. And we claim him as our own for the continent and for the international community. We are very happy to have such leadership demonstrated. And I think Hans-Peter had already started making some of the thank yous in this regard and acknowledgements about commitment and leadership. Just to give you a little bit of background, also on the stage I have with me the management committee members of CABRI. These are budget heads from their countries who are our duly elected representatives which guide the direction of CABRI. I'm pleased to say, just very shortly, so that I won't take up a lot of your time, that we have worked very hard on our new strategic plan. As is our intention, it is full of local content and the priorities of our country, and it is a statement of what we as the countries want. If you are wanting to see in terms of the different areas of public finance management, please hop onto our website and have a look. These gentlemen that you see in front of you have actually been guiding us in this process, and perhaps just to acknowledge them personally as well, we have Mr. Fred Mokumbuza from Rwanda, we have Mr. Samuel Kiu from Kenya, we have Mr. Alaye Barra, who brought his minister with him, and also by extension the ambassador and the deputy ambassador. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Isaac Fraikiu of Ghana. In absentia, I do want to acknowledge our chairperson, who is from Mauritius, Mr. Mahen Rawatia. Unfortunately, because of the change in administration, there is a need for him, obviously, to be at home and attending to his country business, which we will excuse him for, and he obviously had also, together with the rest of the committee members, an aspiration for us to have our annual meeting, for it to be something that is a topic of meaning, for it to be an open event with many, many countries participating. I think we have reached some of the dream. We also have our intention starting to be realized in terms of having representation at the highest level, in terms of ministerial representation. So we definitely say, again, a very big thank you to the Gambia. We have no doubt that in terms of moving forward for the continent and a focus on presenting what is the priority for the continent, of us being clear what our agenda is, we can commit that that is what our strategy is about. And we are very happy to repeat, if I may, some of the words of the Honourable Minister. He spoke to us about not just having buying into DPI as a concept for Africa, but talking about it not just being a vision, and about us taking a step-by-step approach. And also, he spoke about leapfrogging, which I think we certainly appreciate. And he also spoke about leaps and bounds. So somewhere in this iterative, and I would believe an agile approach, if one is leaping around, we certainly hope to see that reflected in the roadmap. And we look forward to what is going to happen in terms of the G20. For South Africa, we say also thank you very much for your representation here, and the expectations from the continent for your leadership in the G20 are actually very high. We stand ready, though, to support you and to be clear around what finance ministries do want. So without elaborating too much, else I'm going to be here for a long time, I can get excited, I want to say to everyone here present and for those viewers online, thank you so much for your participation. And I would also like to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, without whom this was not going to be possible. And also to GIZ, we thank you for your contributions. And my thanks comes to you on behalf of CABRI and of ODI Global. I'm going to stop at this point and ask for any housekeeping announcements, but I think I will herewith formally close the conference. Thank you very much, everyone.